Chapter 31 Moonwood Dawn Morning came. It was relatively peaceful. Birds sang and the morning dew rested upon the grass and leaves. The cold hid away in recesses at the base of trees. The little bits of frost that glazed the leaves began to sink into the dirt. The men were the first to wake. After discussion with the elves, they learned it would be safe enough to start a fire. They began to toil at finding dry brush, wood, and making controlled fires. The men began heating water and dry meat. Some of the formerly wounded began to make use of their good arms and legs. They focused on redeeming themselves however they might. Those others who fought with them, who now lay by the river, would not be forgotten. The noise grew, and more men left their respective wooden shelters. There were enough places to sleep where it wasn't impossible to get some privacy. Based on the size of it, it was probably meant to house a larger force than theirs. The two elves in question spent time in meditation, rather insistent on not being bothered. Instead of sleeping, they merely meditated in a place of quiet. Soon, Moore awakened and Meredith left his bunk. He dressed and left Claire's clothes resting on top of her. Outside, he was met with a small number of hoots and whoops. They were quickly met with a gaze that silenced them. He made his way to the fire and readied what broth was being prepared. Morgan was up, looking distant, but staying busy. Cy came out and briskly walked towards Meredith. So, about last night. Meredith didn't know or care how they found out. It's my business. Off it. Cy's eyebrows went up. Oh, you too? I guess it was a life or death situation. Kenson had already been up apparently, and he helped himself to the broth, taking light sips of it before eating quickly. His interest was gathered too. Cy went on in almost a whisper. Mina and we had it last night. Twice, actually. She woke me up so we could. Not that I complained. Meredith and Kenson had a slow look of what must have been a mix of horror and realization, nervously looking around and sipping their drinks. Meredith rather weakly said, So, Cy went on. Yeah, she was really into it. I guess that happened. Anyway, I wanted to thank you for protecting us last night, keeping watch and all. Kenson gulped food and asked Cy as innocently as he could, You dispelled whatever magic was on Mina, right? Meredith gave him a look of unease, then looked back at Cy, who was blissfully ignorant. Cy nodded. Oh, yeah, easily. Shouldn't be anything left. Why? Meredith began eating and remembering the rescue of Mina. Was the witch hypnotism still working? Cy actually got called away and scurried off with an apology, promising to talk later. Kenson leaned into Meredith. The water priestess apparently still has some of the enchantment the witch left on her, yes? Meredith drank, then wished he had something alcoholic suddenly. Not sure he fully grasped the ethical ramifications of naming Cy as master to a brainwashed water priestess. He supposed Cy didn't know better. They never told him. He said he got rid of the enchantment so he didn't feel the need to warn Cy or anything. Well, it'll probably wear off with time. The witch is dead and the enchantment was dispelled. Kenson looked to the fire. We should tell Cy, yes? Meredith shook his head. I'm just going to let things play out. Maybe she just did that on her own. Cy saved her life. Girls have needs. She needed comfort. Cy isn't a poor match after all. He likes her. It's probably fine. He sounded more like he was trying to convince himself that he had nothing to do with this. Kenson considered a moment. It wouldn't really help to tell them. Well, I suppose nothing can be done of it now. Eyes moved to the elves who approached. Selrith leaned into Meredith. Riders approach. Be ready, but they seem to be allies of some sort. Their singular focus seems to be calling out to the company of Shing, or Meredith, I believe the name was. He rose to his feet. We're in no peril. That is a sure ally. Is there a way to set their path towards us? Any way to guide them or send a message? The elf had a quick answer ready, with a sharp kind of haste in his eyes, as if he was focusing on the distance. Say your message, I'll relay it. He will not hear your voice. If he wishes, he can reply. Meredith felt the elf put a hand on his shoulder. a simple spell to send words at a distance. Meredith began to speak, which the elf repeated exactly as he said it. "The company of Shing is safe. We are safe at camp. Where can we meet Darius?" The elf was quiet, listening to nothing, then speaking back. "Darius sent me to have you gather at the logging town. If possible he needs the aid of the Witchblades. The sooner they help the better. He needs their advice when possible. Meet us at the town at your ready. We'll have supplies. You're not under attack now, are you?" Meredith tried to respond, but the elf stopped him before he kept going. "That's all, a message and a response. We can meet them now. Ready yourselves. We have light and the means to travel." Meredith nodded, looking to the camp. "We have backup heading to the town. Best ready yourselves." They didn't need to get told twice. Some were already packed and assisting others. Kenson made his way near the tree where Claire slept. "I shall wake Claire, yes?" Meredith got up quickly and decided it would be better if he did it. He moved ahead and passed Kenson. He reached the tree and entered quickly, but slowed his pace as he caught sight of Claire. She was already dressed and standing in the center of the room, preparing a small pack. She was already up. He would have figured she slept more, but then she was a witchblade. It sounded as if she was mumbling quietly to herself as Meredith entered, probably counting inventory or the like. "It sounds like reinforcements are heading to town," Meredith said. Claire nodded quietly and lifted up her hood. "Good. But it would have been better if we managed to strike before they went to town. A pity. But at least they know to seek out advice before being foolish. We must reach them in Lorndrum." They weren't going to talk about last night. Not really a point to it. Both were aware they could die at any time. Both were cold and could use some comfort. It didn't need to be more, and it seemed she knew that. As she stepped out, it was all business. A low, silent whistle, and her owl, Hunter, took a spot on her shoulder, sometimes hopping from one shoulder to another. She made her way to the elves and spoke to them for a moment, nodding several times before saying to Meredith, "There is no way to know how large the forces Shing sent or how competent their command is. We need to get to them in order to launch an effective assault. We'll need to hurry. It's likely the Coven will react soon." Chapter 32. Echoes of the Bog. The brush bog had always been a disgusting place. It smelled of death and was full of soot and mud. The tree life was so ancient, the moss golems blended in if they remained still enough. The bog water looked like a dark broth with the occasional frog or eye floating around every so often. The eyes no doubt belonged to crocs, and the frog poison coated. The rats grew so large they could bring down a grown man. The other wildlife wasn't much better. Caves had creatures that lay dormant in the water. Stray undead sometimes wandered aimlessly, and rumors abounded of bats so large they could lift crocs out of the water. Shambling horrors of unknown origin covered in slime and vines moved so slowly it could be said they did not move at all. With all these haunts and creatures, no man should wander within. No foolhardy group stepped near. No army dared come close, not that there was an army near enough to contend with them. Maybe small bands of pirates or stray forces from the major city of Quillen, but none so foolish as to wander into the bog. Deep magic was there, and some believed it the very foundation of witchcraft. The covens all over the world joined them. At first, witches did not need to group up. They had no reason to create covens. It was safer and more secure to be off alone in the woods. They were not a threat to anyone, and by proxy, there was no need to hunt them. Witches collected their trophies in bargains. Very little was done to deal with them, and they were merry in their solitude, far from the company of mortals or other witches. Then a secret gathering began. Sparked, no doubt, by the hunts and the murders of the Fae, they came together in small groups and had relative safety, only then to find larger groups to face them. No matter where a witch hid, it would eventually result in a hunter darkening their doorstep. This was the way of things. Nothing to be done of it. Then began the covens. Groups of witches of such size that only organized militaries or hordes dared face them. A coven lasted long, and usually resulted in many years of witches performing abominations and sacrilege as they saw fit. They were undisturbed until one coven began to stand above the rest. a single coven of such stupendous size that it was doubtful an army would ever face them, led not by a witch, but by a goddess. There was nothing to fear. This coven grew stronger with every witch that joined this goddess. It grew. So large was this grand coven, and so vast, that there was nothing close to oppose them. Even so many did not join, for it was against the very nature of witches. Solitude was not so easily given up. Even those willing to join a coven were unwilling to join a coven of such size. Often small groups of banished witches made their own covens in different locations or split off to make rooms for others in the bog. Every failed attempt to slay the grand coven only made it grow. Other covens began to adopt similar tactics. Many forced mortals to breed and performed rituals on children to make even more witches. Those with magical blood were prized and used for breeding. These children were kept and raised like animals in cages. Others willingly chose to become witches, twisted slowly by the powers of the bog, or perhaps had their wills broken. Witches made bargains with mortals to enslave them. Those foolishly willing to bargain with them found magical contracts strong. Some willingly gave up their freedom to the witches in exchange for something they desired. Soon deals were made by force of power. Those pressured or coerced into making a deal usually did not experience the full force of the magical contract, but enough to create a contract, albeit a weak one. The more willing the person was to make a deal, the more powerful the contract. All the same, the witches used this and other methods to grow their numbers. The coven went so far as to buy trade goods from towns, in order to have enough supplies to support their growing numbers. Buying grain, breeding livestock from the marsh, sending out smaller covens only to have them break apart later. Using changelings to replace entire towns of people by replacing them with witches? This was in and of itself offensive to most witches. It was not their way, and would never be their way. All the same, their goddess didn't care much for their ways. She spat on tradition and only kept the basic nature of the witches intact. The goddess used deception, bargains, and power plays to keep mortal cities from striking them. Indeed, few knew the true strength of the Grand Coven. If sent in full force, it would take a grand army to face them, especially with the might of the goddess. The goddess acted with such deception that few could find or speak to her. As it was, her location was always a mystery and her face hidden well from other witches. If one wished to speak with the goddess, they needed to use powerful rituals at their own peril. That, or go to the matron of the Grand Coven, who was widely considered the most powerful and fiercest of the matrons. Malumbra was the hand of the goddess, and the matron above all others. She kept her beauty despite her impressive age. She looked to be a woman of 30 with raven black hair. She wore no clothes, but clothed herself in dark void energy that clung to her body. Her body was tattooed with portals to other places which should not be. Void tears cracked the edges of her eyes. A deep black inside her eyes and portals shifted around her body, leaving only some patches of skin here and there. Malumbra knew all tongues and did not need to speak with her mouth in order to be heard. It was time to gather the stray covens who had wandered too far away from the goddess's flock. They had made their mistakes, true, but they did not all need to be put to death. Such was the will of the goddess. The bog was overstretched. It was difficult to sustain such large numbers of witches. Their use of magic was rampant, but the goddess made her demand. More. It will be done, Hecate. Sisters of the true coven, your matron speaks. Her voice and mind boomed out through the bog, causing many witches to give pause. Malumbra's hair fluttered behind her with bits of her face hidden by the shifting void portals that clung to her skin. Bits of one eye could be seen, while the other was obstructed. Another moment her mouth might be completely gone. Such was the mistress of the void which floated, defying gravity and all laws of nature. The only thing which functioned as clothes being the darkness of the void, which shifted throughout her body. She cast her gaze to the darkness of the sky, and spoke, adding vigor where she could. Another coven faces grave peril. The traitor Isidora has revealed herself. Such is she that she cannot survive. The will of the goddess be done. She shall die. But others do not share Isidora's betrayal. They have not forsaken the grand coven. Hecate shall open up her arms and her coven. You will ready for visitors. A feast is to be prepared. Go now, ready to accept them." The witches let out cheers and whoops. The other coven might have had 30 members. This one had hundreds. If the power of the Grand Coven and their magical might were combined, they could bring down entire cities with storms and great magics. So far they had not used it. Their goddess had no need to defend them. They were a force so vast and with so many natural barriers, there was no opposing them. Melumbra floated high above the bog. "Hecate has made it clear to me what must be done. I shall go. I am the wrath of the queen. As harbinger of the goddess, I shall make known her place in this world, above all beings. Hail to the goddess!" It mattered not if the witches approved of the state of things or had a real love for the goddess. They were a part of the coven. In part, one could say they were prisoners, as their labor was due to the goddess. The other witches added to her chant, "And hail to the witch queen! Hail to the grand coven!" Another loud cheer from the bog, one that spelled horror for the world at large. The one bit of pleasure they knew was the satisfaction of conquest. They had no idea what they were up against.